Roy Casagrande. Today we're diving into the views of Roy Casagrande, a political science professor from the US with a deep knowledge of European and global history. His analysis of Brexit might just surprise you. Casagrande points to three primary reasons for Brexit: the Syrian refugee crisis, EU immigration, and austerity policies in the UK.
2016 is just one of those years where every vote that you look at, you go, why? I don't understand. Like Duterte in the Philippines. I'm just, what are you doing? What are you doing? Why? And then Brexit. Like I called Brexit, I got it right, even though I know I was bucking the polls. But the reason is because I have no faith. Well, I do, totally. I think you're totally predictable, that 9 times out of 10, you will do the worst possible imaginable thing. So I totally have faith in you to do the worst possible imaginable thing. So that's why I believe Brexit would happen. The reason Brexit happened boiled down to 3 major issues. One was the Syrian refugees. The Syrian refugees had nothing to do with Britain being part of the EU. It had to do with a 1951 UN treaty. And a refugee is running for their life. They're not, this is involuntary. They didn't go, maybe, that's not a refugee, that's an immigrant. A refugee, they've got like 30 minutes, 30 seconds, something like that, to grab whatever they can and flee because they're gonna die. And they're taking, like, people are like, I don't know why they're taking chances with their children. Because their children are going to die, and they're trying desperately to save their children. Like, this is not one of those. So that was one of the reasons why Brexit happened, was British were angry about all those Syrian refugees.
And here's the kicker. The UK took in fewer refugees than a small town's worth, but somehow Nigel made them the country's public enemy #1. Nigel also managed to get the public to hate the EU when actually it was to do with the UN in the 1951 Refugee Convention, created in order to ensure that the horrors of World War II didn't happen again. But of course Nigel doesn't do that. In fact, here's an interesting stat for you. In America, while these Jewish refugees were coming over, Americans cited that their main reason for not wanting these Jewish refugees to come over was because they were concerned that they'd be German terrorists. Now have a listen to what Nigel had to say.
A fifth column living within our countries, a group of people, though mercifully small in number, who actually hate us. They despise our way of life and they want to destroy it. So that threat has been there for a very, very long time. My beef, my argument, and what really upsets me is that for the last 6 months, we've been adding to that problem by allowing terrorists to come into Europe posing as migrants and refugees. And I have repeatedly said that if we go on over the next few years accepting countless millions of people, too many of them will be terrorists.
But the kicking continues, because in that poster, none of them actually end up in the UK. They all go to Germany.
Well, how did it affect Britain? How many of those people got to Britain?
Because you don't seem to understand, we are members of a political union. Despite the fact we're opted out, I'm pleased to say, of some bits of it, we're still a member of that union, and it's a union that's failing, and I don't want us to stay part of this failure.
Yeah, but how many of those people in the poster made it to Britain? None.
Well, that is not what the poster was about. As I say, the EU has failed us all.
You said
what
breaking
I can tell
point.
The Schengen zone with barriers going up everywhere is, I think...
We're not in Schengen.
We're not in Schengen. Those Syrian refugees aren't coming. The EU hasn't failed. The earth isn't flat. But Nigel will have you think that all of that is true. What is true is that 60% of refugees worldwide are from the Middle East, and the West and Britain have a lot to answer for causing that refugee crisis.
Now, what's weird, of course, is that had nothing to do with the EU. Another reason why Brexit happened was because of all the Polish people living in Europe, in England. Poland had joined the EU in 2008, so Poland had been in the EU for 8 years, and in that 8 years, 1 million Poles had moved to Britain, mostly to London. And as UKIP put it, the UK Independence Party, the UKIP leader, Farage, I can't remember his first name, Nigel. He said the difference between us and the Conservatives is the Conservatives hate all the colored immigrants coming to England. We don't just hate them, we also hate all the white immigrants coming to England, right? They wanted to break away from the EU to stop more Poles from moving to England. Like it really was a case of, oh, you're the undesirable form of European. Now that made Brexit make sense, because once you Brexit, all those Poles now are gonna have to go get visas because they didn't have British citizenship, they had EU citizenship. They had a right to be in Britain because Britain was a member of the EU. So if Britain wasn't a member of the EU, all those Poles were gonna have to go and reapply to be in Great Britain and get a visa or leave.
The latest figures confirm a trend. Europeans are leaving Britain. The statistics show that 53,000 people from EU8 countries, including Poland, Slovakia, Lithuania and Hungary, went home last year. And net migration from Europe into the UK fell to its lowest level in a decade.
Poland joins the EU in 2004, and suddenly the UK has a wave of hard-working Poles filling jobs and ironically contributing to the economy. Nigel and his group went out of their way to make that sound like it was a bad thing. But here's the kicker. Whilst saying that, they were also suggesting that we should be looking after our own. That was a key comment. Except, listen to them now.
Apart from the NHS and public sector workers, I don't think anyone at all benefits from this budget.
Well, I'll tell you who benefits from this budget, the people who do the least. So basically benefits claimants, because what this budget should have done is incorporated a massive campaign to reduce the welfare bill.
What she's really talking about is carers, students, the sick, and retirees. The people that Brexiteers promised to protect are now the scum of the earth, and they're out to get them because they can no longer attack the EU.
And they are completely unjustified. And by not announcing such a crackdown, Rachel Reeves basically turned this into a budget of removing resources from those who work in order to keep on sustaining those who frankly can't be bothered to get out of bed and get themselves out, whether it's to an office or to any kind of job, and prefer to just sit on the sofa and order their Deliveroo and drive their Motability free vehicle and take everything that the state can offer. And the state, well, that is people like you and me and our very many listeners who are grafting just to try to make ends meet. And basically, these people are frankly parasites.
That's the language they were using for immigrants, and now they're using for Brits, and it reminds me of a quote from Pastor Niemöller from Nazi Germany. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So when they attack the Poles and immigrants, really deep down, they just hate people who are working class, anyone sick or weak, anyone they deem different. Just take note from the fact that she seems to think she knows better than any doctor about a diagnosis of whether or not someone's sick. That's what she's saying. And her only conclusion to that is they must be lying. It's like kicking your plumber out halfway through fixing your bathroom because you're taking back control. Sure, you're in control, but the likelihood is you're standing in a puddle with no working toilet or sink. And then he touches on a point that's been completely ignored for all those Brits that live in the EU.
Of course, there's the tragedy of all those Brits who are living in the EU who are going to have to do the same thing.
I was absolutely amazed by the way I felt when I saw the result. I broke into tears immediately. I was angry, I was depressed, I was in disbelief.
My husband is French, he's a French engineer. My plan was that I would be here with him while he worked, and then when we retired I was planning on moving back to England. The trouble is that he's French and the settled status would probably be refused. But I would have liked to have been able to move home, and I can't do that anymore, and it hurts.
We never thought that there would be any political success in getting anyone in Britain to reconsider the decision. That's how it was. But I think we were hoping for a softer Brexit. So yeah, it was stressful, and we talked to friends who were in similar positions with what have been kind of part-time homes who thought, what are we going to do?
The third reason why the British backed Brexit was austerity. Their economy was being tightened and crushed. They were losing services. Money was being pulled out of everything. It was being pulled out of the welfare system, the medical system. It was being pulled out of the education system. Britain was in the midst of this really rough austerity package that had nothing to do with the EU. The EU did not impose that austerity package. The Conservative government that promised to have a referendum on Brexit is the government that imposed the austerity package on the Brits. So the British, who hated the austerity package, re-elected the guys who created the austerity package, and who then proposed that they have a referendum on Brexit. And then the guy, of course, that did that was David Cameron. He did the austerity, and then he's the one who said, I promise you a referendum on Brexit. Then said, after he got re-elected, I'm against Brexit, please don't vote yes. And of course, they voted yes. And so he blew up his own career. But the reason they voted yes was because of the austerity package that they misidentified as coming from Europe, even though it came from London, right? In other words, they were right. There was something there. Not the immigrant thing, that's stupid. But there was the austerity thing, that was real. They were being crushed, they just misidentified where that crushing was coming from. So then there's this next step. The next step is that we live in a society, we live in a world, the United States and Great Britain, where we do this spin thing, where everything is deflection, where facts don't matter, where data is unimportant, where studies don't account for anything. So my favorite of these is there's voter fraud. A study was done. It's looked at the last few elections. A total of 1 billion votes were examined. And they found 31 cases of voter fraud out of 1 billion. In other words, it doesn't exist. No matter how many times you reference that article, the person you're arguing with will go, it's a bias study. How do you know it's a bias study? Did you do a counter study? I'd like to see that counter study. How many fraudulent votes did you find in the billion? Oh, you didn't do a study. So it's a bias study because it didn't show what you wanted it to show. A fun study that's a few years old, I want to say it's like 6 years old, something like that, showed that 50% of the lower class gets married, whereas it's like 90% of the middle class gets married. So I posted that on Facebook because I found that fascinating. I didn't expect it to be 50% of the lower class. I thought it would be higher. And a person wrote back and goes, I don't believe it. And I'm like, reference the study. And they go, yeah, I looked at the study, I just don't believe it. And I should care what you believe or don't believe. Like, I mean, at that point, why not? I think the sun's green, right? I mean, at that point, how do you have a conversation with this person if facts aren't on the table, if facts don't matter?
Essentially what he's describing is a cult, and to get someone out of a cult is incredibly difficult. We're talking maybe years. We even have to conclude maybe never. That people are so embedded, so in love with this cult and its leaders, they will do anything to protect it.
So a few years ago, a study was conducted, Harvard, about austerity and whether austerity was good for an economy or not. And by the way, this study ended up getting enough attention that governments around the world actually went ahead and did austerity based almost exclusively on the study. The study said austerity is good for an economy, that cutting social services, cutting education, cutting infrastructure development, cutting maintenance, that if you do that, it will actually improve. Like, who thinks this? How did you get there? It turns out the researchers had manipulated the hell out of the data. So you can find it. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It turns out austerity is the worst thing you can do to an economy unless you like them crashed.
And instead of Cameron, Johnson, Osborne, or anyone else taking responsibility, they allowed the media to blame migrants and the European Union. And of course the same thing is happening in the United States. And politicians in the United Kingdom, they're backing the man who's saying the same things as them, because either they're racist or they're too f***ing stupid to realise that the issue is to do with trade, to do with COVID, to do with war, and arguably taking the handbrakes of capitalism.
When you say, for example, that Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers, right? It's not an innocent comment. You are making across the spectrum attack on a whole group of people. There's no way any rational, reasonable person could believe for a second that that was an unbiased statement, especially if you do the data thing. It turns out immigrants commit crime in the United States at a lower rate than we do. So, for example, if you wanted to lower crime in the United States, a fast way to do it would be to eject people like me and bring in a bunch of immigrants. It will go down. So the data doesn't bear out the statement. And so at that point, you have to ask yourself the question, why are you making this statement? So the thing I keep hearing from the Trump supporters is, I'm not voting for Trump because he's a racist. I don't care about that. I'm not voting for Trump because he's a sexist. I don't care about that. I'm not voting for Trump because he hates certain religious groups. I don't care about that. I'm voting for Trump because the economy is crap and I want to hurt the people in Washington, D.C. But that's not what's being heard. What the person in the position of weakness is hearing, because white males dominate the society, period, is it's a referendum on who's a first-class citizen and who's not. That's what they heard. They didn't hear the economy's crap. I'm going to vote for the guy who looks just like the guys who made the economy crap to begin with. They heard Mexicans cannot ever be first-class citizens, especially when that judge, his ancestors were Mexican. So you could be born and raised here, become a judge, and people are still going to go, no, you're not really one of us. And of course, that then applies to blacks. It applies especially to Muslims and Arabs.
So there you have it. Brexit in a nutshell. A referendum that blamed Brussels for problems made in Westminster, stirred up fears of an immigrant invasion that didn't exist, and somehow punished hard-working Polish folks for daring to fix pipes and pull pints. People didn't vote for change, they voted for a scapegoat. So the next time someone says Brexit means Brexit, remember sometimes the biggest political decisions are really just a group having a tantrum on a national scale. If you've made it this far, congratulations! You now know more about Brexit than most of the people who voted for it. Don't forget to like, subscribe and drop a comment below. Did Brexit solve anything, or is it just one big lesson in self-inflicted wounds? And to all my supporters on Patreon and YouTube, thank you for helping keep this channel going and growing. If you'd like to join, there are links in the description. Thanks for watching, bye for now.